All right, so in the previous video, I said there's this thing called namespaces, which is the old way of sharing code and working in organizing your code, rather, in TypeScript. But now TypeScript supports ES module syntax, also known as ES6 modules, where we use the import and export keywords. So we can use this, I'll just show an example of this, to share code between files. Let's start super simple. I'll make a source directory just like always. Let's make an index.ts file. Make this a bit larger. I don't need much of the terminal at the moment. And I can write some basic code in there, console.log, hello world. I'm not going to bother with HTML or running this in the browser with a server. I'll just leave it as is for now. I just want to show you that if I make some other file like utils.ts, this will have some utility functions. I can write some function here like, I don't know, this is stupid, but we'll do add, right? X and Y, and we return X plus Y, but we're writing TypeScript and we're using implicit any, so I'm going to say X has to be a number and Y has to be a number. Make sure I put that R in there. All right, so we return X and Y. And then let's just do one more. Let's do function sample, which will accept some list. This could actually be real fancy if you want it to be. We can say it's a generic function. It takes some type, and it takes an array of that type. So we'll call this ARR, which is going to be an array of that type, and then it returns a single element of that type. Oh, look at that nasty syntax for generics. Anyway, we're saying this generic function takes some type, you pass in some array of that type, and it returns an element of that type. So we're going to pick some random element, const index equals math.random times array.length, and then we'll floor that whole thing. And then we will return array at that index. Okay, so we have two utility functions now I've split up into this file. And imagine we're writing a large application with hundreds of files. Of course, we're going to break our code into different chunks and not have one massive file. But then we need to share that code and, require it or import it into different places. So over here in my index.ts file, let's say I want to use sample and add. I have a question. What do you think will happen if I try and call sample right here? I'm going to get an error, but what am I getting an error for? The answer is actually that sample is found just fine. TypeScript didn't complain that it didn't know about sample. It's complaining because I didn't provide an argument. So in fact, sample is known to TypeScript and it's known in this file. So is add 1 and 2, no problem. And that might seem a little bit counterintuitive. You would think, normally in a JavaScript file, each file is just its own script. You have to include them in the right order if you want to have access to other things from files, let alone, worrying about modules. But if you go back to the docs here, the first chunk is about non-modules. Before we start, it's important to understand what TypeScript considers a module. The spec for JS declares that any files without an export or a top-level await should be considered a script and not a module. So right now we're working inside of a script. It's not a module because there's no export anywhere. And when you're inside a script, any variables and types are declared to be in the shared global scope. So right now, everything is in the shared global scope, right? So if I type something over here, const x equals 1, and over here in a totally different file, const x equals 2, I'm going to get an error. Cannot redeclare block scoped variable x. I'm not working with modules here. So this is all just considered in the global scope. And that's kind of the point of modules, is that we want to be able to separate our code, organize it, have different namespaces. Although when I say namespace, I'm not necessarily referring to TypeScript namespaces, just the general concept of having namespaces. So if I were to then, export this code or not export it, compile it, I think I need to do a TSC init so I can just direct TypeScript to the correct location. I'm going to say just include the source directory. Include is going to be the array that has source inside. Then I'll say out directory should be dist. Okay. All right. So if I compile with TSC, let's see what we end up with. My JavaScript files have nothing to do with one another, right? I have to go and include these files in the correct order if I actually want to use them in the browser. I would have to make sure this file is included as a script first in an HTML file, and then I need to include this one because it's calling sample and add. So TypeScript, when it's looking at my code, when it's compiling it, if I'm not declaring any modules, if I'm just working in the global namespace, then it doesn't complain at all. It's totally fine. It just assumes that I'm going to handle the whole organizing and including things and all of that. So that might surprise some of you how that works, but as soon as we introduce export anywhere, things are going to change.